She was 52 when her life shattered, and the cruelest part was that from the outside, she seemed like an ordinary woman, even stable. It had been 28 years of marriage, a routine built with patience, predictable schedules, and long silences that she had learned not to question. She lived in a city where people think they know you just because they see you repeating the same routes for years. And at that point in her life, she was trying something simple, learning to be with herself after decades of being the wife of. She wasn't a fragile or dependent woman. On the contrary, she had always been the one who maintained the invisible details of the house, the one who solved problems before they were even noticed, the one who postponed her own needs so that everything would keep running smoothly. Precisely for that reason, when it all happened, it wasn't with screams or dramatic scenes. It was a silent, surgical fall, as if someone had disconnected the floor beneath her feet without a warning. The day her husband told her he was with another woman wasn't the day she lost everything. That had already happened without her knowing. He had emptied accounts, closed investments, and reorganized assets with a coldness that is still difficult to explain without feeling nauseous. When she tried to pay for something as simple as a coffee and her card was declined, she felt a dry shame, the kind that burns inside. At the bank, the manager spoke to her, as if she were a misinformed stranger, and at home, he gave her a short deadline to pack her things, as if he were evicting someone who had taken up too much space. The worst part wasn't just losing the money or the house, it was losing people. Friends who stopped calling, neighbors who avoided looking at her, stares filled with silent judgment. With time running out and her pride shattered, she did something she never thought she would. She sold her wedding ring. Not as a symbolic act, but as a practical and painful decision. With that money, she bought a train ticket. She didn't have a clear plan. All she knew was that she needed to leave before she disappeared completely. The train journey was anything but poetic. It wasn't an elegant escape or a scene from a movie. It was long, uncomfortable, and silent, with that constant metallic clang that leaves you with nothing but the passage of time. She sat by the window with a borrowed backpack and a plastic bag containing what was left of her life. 2 changes of clothes, documents folded with exaggerated care, and an old photograph she hadn't had the strength to throw away. She stared at her reflection in the glass and barely recognized herself. Her eyes were sunken, her skin dull, her hair haphazardly pulled back, like someone who had simply stopped caring out of sheer exhaustion. At each stop, she felt an absurd fear that someone would recognize her, as if shame could travel. When the train began to slow down because of the weather, she noticed the sky closing in, heavy, announcing snow. It wasn't just the cold. It was that feeling that the world was paused, suspended, as if nothing would move for a while. And deep down, there was a persistent thought, I have nowhere to go back to. The station where she had to get off wasn't on the map. It was a forced stop due to the blizzard, one of those technical decisions that change lives without asking permission. As soon as she stepped onto the platform, the cold hit her violently, like a slap that chills the body. The air burned her lungs and made her ears ache. That's when she saw him, an older man, hunched over, wearing a thin coat too light for the weather, his hands trembling in a way that wasn't just age. He wasn't asking for anything, wasn't holding out his hand, wasn't saying a word. He was just there, staring at the ground, like someone who had grown accustomed to being unseen. She approached him impulsively without thinking, because sometimes the body decides before the head. She heard her own stomach growl. She hadn't eaten in hours, and yet she reached into her pocket and pulled out the only bill she had left, $10. She gave it to him almost ashamedly, murmuring something about a hot drink. In that gesture, there was no heroism, no hope of return, no expectation of gratitude. It was simply raw humanity, offered from the very depths of her being. At that moment, she didn't know, and couldn't have known, that she had just moved an invisible piece that would change everything. Denver didn't welcome her like in the movies. The city was covered in thick, old, trampled snow, that dirty white that reflects nothing, only absorbs sound and spirit. She got off the train with a suitcase too light for a whole life, feeling the cold seep into her bones like a constant warning. She had no address, no phone number to call, no plan beyond never come back. She walked several blocks aimlessly, going into cafes just to warm her hands, leaving quickly because she couldn't order anything without feeling ashamed. In every shop window, she saw her own vulnerable reflection, the borrowed coat, the messy hair pulled back, the eyes tired of crying. She tried to look for work that same day, as if urgency could bend reality. Everywhere she went, the same phrase, uttered with automatic politeness. They needed an address, a local reference, something to prove she existed there. And so began the cruel cycle, the one that no one explains to you until you're in it. I needed a job to have somewhere to live, and I needed somewhere to live to get a job. That first night ended in a shelter that smelled of thin soup, cheap disinfectant, and human exhaustion. The place wasn't violent or cruel, but it held a dense, shared sadness, as if all the stories hung in the air. They gave her a narrow bed, a rough blanket, and a number written in marker on her wrist, something that made her feel less human and more like a shift. Around her, other women slept on their sides, clutching backpacks, plastic bags, mementos. Some murmured in their dreams, others stared at the ceiling as if they didn't dare close their eyes. She spent hours awake, listening to coughs, footsteps, the screech of the old heater whirring unevenly. At some point, she thought of her old home, of the orderly silence of before, and felt a pang of anger at how quickly it had all vanished. She didn't feel like a failure. She felt invisible, which was worse. And yet, in the midst of that feeling of having hit rock bottom, something inside her remained standing, small but firm, refusing to accept that this was the end of her story. The night the train came to a complete halt, no one made any clear announcements. There was only an eerie, thick silence, followed by the sound of the wind rattling the windows, as if someone were throwing handfuls of icy sand from outside. The snowfall had closed the tracks, and the makeshift station was little more than a dimly lit shelter with metal benches that stifled the body's warmth. She stepped off the train, her scarf haphazardly rolled, and her hands stiff, carrying a light bag that felt heavier on the inside than the outside. It was there that she saw him, an older man, hunched over, wearing a coat too thin for the cold, trembling in a way that wasn't just physical, it was existential. He wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't reaching out. He was just there, staring at the ground, as if waiting were the only skill he had left. She recognized that state because she'd been carrying it inside her for days. It was the exact image of someone whom life had inexplicably put on hold. She checked the inside pocket of her coat almost reflexively, like someone who already knows the answer before asking. He had $10 folded several times, worn, soft from being touched so much. It was everything. There was no card. There was no plan B. There was nothing waiting on the other side. At the head, they tried to negotiate, listing reasons for not doing anything: cold, heat, uncertain future. But my body was faster. She approached, placed the money on his hand, and said something simple, quasi silly, about having something hot. I have no speech. I have no exchange of names. I have no promise. The man raised his eyes with a child's surprise, something that has not been seen in adults for decades. When she got tired, I felt an immediate emptiness, a dry medium without anything, and at the same time, something strange, a Minimal calm, quays imperceptible, as I knew for a few seconds the active grass was burning before everything turned. She didn't know at that time, but that small gesture, just in the worst possible night, she had just moved an invisible gear that would change the rest of her life. Denver didn't welcome her with promises or warm lights. It welcomed her with dry wind, a sky the color of old metal, and an immediate feeling of not belonging. For the first few hours, she wandered aimlessly, dragging her suitcase as if it weighed more on the inside than the outside. She went into cafes just to warm her hands and left without ordering anything because every dollar already had a name and a fear attached to it. She quickly discovered how cruel a city can be when you don't have an address to write on a form. In every impromptu interview, the question was the same: "Where do you live?" And every time she hesitated for a second before answering, she saw the other person's face change, as if that second revealed something sordid. She learned that without a home she didn't exist, and without existing she couldn't work. That absurd logic trapped her in just a few days. At night, she sat on bus stop benches just to watch people with clean backpacks, keys hanging from their belts, with a clear destination. No one gave them a second glance, but they did look at her, and not in the way one would want. The shelter appeared the way last resorts do, not out of hope, but out of exhaustion. The building was old, with walls that smelled of thin soup and cheap detergent, and a heating system that worked only halfway, as if it too were weary. She barely slept the first night. Not out of fear, but because of the invisible noise of other people's stories, sighs, low sobs, bodies turning on thin mattresses. There she understood that falling doesn't always come with screams. Sometimes it arrives in silence, with women who once had homes, jobs, routines, and now shared the same. Roof for different reasons, but with a similar shame. She clung to small rituals so as not to lose herself, folding her clothes carefully, washing her face even if the mirror was smudged, giving thanks quietly for each sunrise. She didn't know how long she would be there. She only knew that for the first time since everything had fallen apart, no one was asking her to pretend to be okay. And that, in a strange way, hurt and relieved at the same time. The shelter was in an old building, its bricks darkened by time and the smoke of long winters. Inside, it smelled of thin soup, cheap detergent, and human weariness. It wasn't a violent place, but it wasn't friendly either. It was a place of transit, where no one wanted to stay longer than necessary. The first night, she barely slept. The mattress was thin. The din of snores, low sobs, and volunteer footsteps came and went like waves. What hurt the most, however, wasn't her stiff body or the cold that seeped in through the old windows. It was the feeling of having become invisible. No one asked who she had been before. No one wanted to know what she had lost. There, they were all just tired women with worn backpacks and broken stories. And yet, for the first time in weeks, she didn't need to pretend she was okay. She could be broken without explaining anything. One of those early mornings, sitting in a plastic chair with a weak cup of coffee in her hands, she thought something that she would later write here. Almost. Without realizing it, if anyone is reading this far, they probably already know what it's like to feel out of place, as if life has gone on without warning. And if you feel like it, leave a comment saying where you're reading from, because sometimes just knowing we're not alone, even if it's through a screen, already eases the weight on our chests. As the days passed, she began to notice details that you only see when you live there. The woman who always folded laundry in silence and cried. Hidden in the bathroom, the young woman who pretended to be strong but jumped at the slightest noise, the mother who counted coins before accepting juice for her son. Each story was different, but the thread was the same. No one had planned to fall. She herself quickly entered the city's cruel cycle. She needed a job to have an address, and she needed an address to get a job. She sent out resumes from borrowed computers, went to interviews in carefully laundered clothes from the shelter, and smiled more than she felt like it. Inside, however, something was beginning to settle in a strange way. Perhaps because she had nothing left to lose, perhaps because that gesture at the station had opened an invisible crack. Not hope yet, but a kind of strange calm, like when you've hit rock bottom and your body understands that, somehow, it's still breathing. When they finally took her to William's house, the first thing that struck her wasn't its size, nor the silent, snow-covered gardens, nor the walls covered in antique paintings that seemed to watch her patiently. It was the smell. It smelled of clean wood, of freshly brewed coffee, and something akin to home, a word she no longer used even in thought. William no longer seemed fragile or lost. He was still an older man, yes, but there was a firm calm in his demeanor, an authority that didn't need to be imposed. He didn't speak quickly or try to impress her. He told her, with an almost painful serenity, that after his wife's death, he had lost all trust in people, that he felt invisible even surrounded by money, that for weeks he had gone out like that, nameless, statusless, unprotected, just to see if anyone was still capable of looking at another human being without asking for anything in return. And then he looked at her without drama and told her that those $10 had been the first genuine thing he had received in years. She listened to everything in silence, with a strange mixture of disbelief and modesty, as if someone were reading aloud a part of her life she herself couldn't name. William didn't speak of rewards or miracles. He spoke of dignity, of purpose, of a foundation his wife had created to help vulnerable people, but which he had let run on autopilot, soulless. He told her he didn't want to save her, that he didn't need a pretty story to feel better about himself. What he wanted was to offer her something real, a job, a concrete role, a chance to rebuild her life without owing anything to anyone. She didn't cry then. Crying would have been too easy. What she did was feel, for the first time in a long time, that someone saw her as a whole person, and not as a fragment. She accepted not out of gratitude, but because she understood that this wasn't charity. It was an open door she could walk through with her head held high. The first few days at the foundation were strange for her, like walking in borrowed shoes that didn't quite fit. It wasn't charity, she felt, and that disconcerted her. It was responsibility. She was given simple tasks at first, organizing old files, helping to coordinate schedules, listening to stories without interrupting. And listening, she discovered, was harder than any physical labor. Each person who arrived carried a different version of the same breakdown she had experienced. Silent betrayals, unfair dismissals, ignored illnesses, families who had abandoned them. Sometimes, at the end of the day, she would sit alone with a now cold cup of coffee, feeling all of it ache in her body as if each other's story triggered a stored memory. But, for the first time in a long time, that pain didn't overwhelm her. It kept her awake. There was something profoundly human about being there, about not running from the suffering of others, about not looking the other way as so many had done to her. As the weeks passed, she began to notice a quiet change within herself. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something more solid, more subtle. Dignity. She had a schedule again, decisions to make, a reason to get up early, even as the snow continued to pile up on the outskirts of town. William appeared from time to time, never as a savior, but as someone who observed with attention and respect. They didn't talk about the past. There was no need. She began to propose small, almost timid ideas to improve the reception of newly arrived women. An informal mentoring system, a safe space where they could tell their story without haste, without forms. And, surprisingly, those ideas worked. Other women began to stay longer, to find work, to smile with less guilt. She understood then something she hadn't seen before. Her fall hadn't left her empty. It had made her useful in a new way. As the weeks passed, life began to take a shape that wasn't comfortable, but it was stable. She still woke up early, even without an alarm, because the body takes time to unlearn years of routine. She helped in the shelter's kitchen, organized donations, listened to stories that seemed like echoes of her own, told with different words and accents. There were women who had lost everything to illness, others to violence, others simply because they trusted the wrong person. And in the midst of that harsh coexistence, without makeup or masks, she began to feel something she hadn't felt since before her marriage: usefulness. It wasn't charity, it was human exchange. A glance, a hot meal, a phrase spoken at the right moment. At night, when she lay down on the narrow bunk, with the sound of other people's breathing around her, she thought that perhaps she hadn't hit rock bottom to disappear, but to relearn how to exist without asking permission. Pride didn't hurt so much anymore. Shame had lost its power. And that, though it may seem small, was enormous. It was on an ordinary morning, grey like so many others, when the past and the future collided head-on. A coordinator from the shelter called her by her full name, with that formality never used. There, and that alone tightened her chest. Outside, standing almost absurdly in front of the simple building, was a long, silent black car that clashed completely with its surroundings. When the man got out, she recognized him before she understood. Not by his clothes, now immaculate, nor by his firm posture, but by his eyes. They were the same tired eyes from the season, only now clear, present, deeply attentive. William didn't talk about wealth immediately. He talked about loss, about his wife, about the silence of the too-big house, about his decision to test the world because he no longer believed in it. He recounted that she was the only one who didn't ask for anything, who didn't request anything, who simply brought a tremendous human being. And there, without dramatic music, without rehearsed speech, he offers something concrete: work, purpose, tempo. Not a rescue, but a reconstruction. Ila asetu without korah. Because at that moment, for the first time in a very long time, she was not being scarred by grief. She was being remade by what she was. As the months passed, something inside her stopped hurting the same way. Not because the wound had disappeared, but because it no longer controlled her. She began to notice small but profound changes. She no longer woke up with that pressure in her chest. She no longer revisited the past like someone searching for a mistake to punish themselves for again. Her work at the foundation grew without her asking for it. People trusted her naturally, perhaps because she didn't speak from theory, but from the raw experience of having been at rock bottom. She learned to read silences, to recognize empty stares, to detect when someone said, "I'm fine," just to avoid making her uncomfortable. Denver ceased to be a foreign place and became a new emotional map, built on slow steps, modest cafes, cold mornings, and the certainty that, even after losing everything, she was still capable of being useful, dignified, and respected. It was almost a year later when the past tried to creep back in, as if it had the right. Her ex-husband appeared first with long messages, written in the early hours of the morning, filled with rehearsed phrases about regret, mistakes, and nostalgia. Then came the calls, the broken tone, the plea disguised as humility. She had lost the house, the status, the money. The life she had built on his betrayal had crumbled with the same coldness with which he had abandoned her. When he finally saw her, face to face, he didn't find the broken woman he had expected. He found someone resolute, serene, with a gaze that no longer asked for permission. She listened to him without flinching and understood something definitive. It wasn't her duty to rescue the man who had ruined her. Saying no was her final act of liberation, and this time it didn't hurt. Over time, she began to occupy a larger role within the foundation, almost without realizing it. At first, she helped with simple tasks, then she coordinated teams, and later she designed entire programs. There was something about the way she listened that made all the difference. She didn't look down on anyone because she had truly been at the bottom. The women at the shelter trusted her because they knew she didn't speak from theory, but from experience. Denver ceased to be a cold, anonymous city and began to have landmarks. The coffee shop where they called her by name, the park where she walked at the end of the day to clear her head, the office where she hung up her coat and felt that the place also belonged to her. Her life no longer revolved around what she had lost, but around what she was building with her own hands. And there were nights when, as she closed the door of her small apartment, she thought about the woman who had arrived with an old suitcase and no plans, and she struggled to recognize herself in that reflection. Sometimes she thought, and she wrote it like this, without embellishment, that these stories only survive because someone keeps reading when all seems lost, that if you've made it this far, perhaps it's not by chance. Maybe you know that feeling of hitting rock bottom and not knowing how to climb back up. If you feel like it, share this story with someone going through their own winter, or leave a comment saying where you're reading from. Sometimes feeling seen is the first step to not giving up. The past didn't disappear entirely, but it lost its power. Her ex-husband wrote one last time, months later, with a different tone, less arrogance, more weariness. He spoke of mistakes, of therapy, of trying to rebuild his life from the wreckage. She read the letter without anger, without guilt, and without nostalgia. She didn't reply, not out of revenge, but because she understood she had nothing left unfinished there. Her closure had been internal, silent, and definitive. A year after that snowy night, she was no longer invisible or broken. She held a formal position within the foundation, led programs that changed real lives, and slept peacefully. It had all begun with a small, almost absurd gesture, $10 at a freezing station, and now, every time it snowed in Denver, she smiled with a mixture of respect and gratitude, because she knew that even on the darkest day she had chosen to be human, and that had given her back her life. A year after that snowy night, the transformation was no longer abstract or symbolic. It was visible in the most concrete details. The foundation had grown quietly but steadily, the way things done with purpose, not ego, grow. Training programs, practical mentorship, psychological support, and basic guidance for women who arrived with nothing, just as she had. Some of the women at the shelter were already working, others had found their own place to live, and still others had simply recovered something that seemed lost forever. The ability to look at themselves in the mirror without shame. She walked the halls with a newfound serenity, not the false calm of someone pretending to be fine, but the profound tranquility of someone who knows her pain was used for something worthwhile. Sometimes, as she closed her office door at the end of the day, she would find herself taking a deep breath, as if her body were only now understanding that she was no longer in danger. It was during this time that her ex-husband's letter arrived. It wasn't dramatic or long, nor was it heroic. It was clumsy, almost childish. He spoke of mistakes, therapy, financial ruin, and loneliness. He said he had lost the house, that life hadn't turned out as he'd imagined, that he now understood things he hadn't seen before. She read the letter only once, sitting in silence, and felt neither anger nor overwhelming compassion. She felt closure. She didn't respond immediately, not as a strategy, but because it was no longer urgent. Days later, she wrote a brief, firm, and respectful reply, making it clear that she would not again take on the role of savior to the man who had destroyed her. When she sealed the envelope, she didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She simply understood that the cycle was complete, not because he had changed, but because she no longer needed him to change in order to move forward. Over time, the foundation began to grow in ways she had never imagined. It was no longer just a temporary shelter for homeless women. It became a space for genuine rebuilding, with training, programs, mentorship, emotional support, and practical guidance for those who had fallen silent just like her. The most powerful thing was witnessing the small changes. Women who at first wouldn't maintain eye contact, who spoke in short, defensive sentences, and who months later were already discussing ideas, plans, and the future. She recognized herself in each one, not out of pity, but from the living memory of what it means to be ripped from one's life without warning. She learned to lead, without harshness, with a quiet firmness born of someone who had already lost everything. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand respect. Her story spoke for itself, and every time she walked through the halls of the shelter, she felt something inside her readjust, as if her pain had finally found a legitimate place in the world. A year after that snowy night, she received a letter she hadn't expected. It was from her ex-husband. He wasn't asking to come back. He wasn't promising love. He spoke of mistakes, financial ruin, belated therapy, and a life that no longer held up as it once had. She read it all slowly, with a calm she hadn't possessed before, and for the first time she felt neither anger nor the urge to explain herself. She closed the envelope, certain that it was no longer her responsibility to carry this burden. That same day, William informed her that he would be assuming an even greater role within the foundation, something that symbolized trust and continuity. As she left the building, the cold air vaguely reminded her of that season, that snowstorm, that $10 bill handed over without hope. She smiled, not out of nostalgia, but out of clarity. She understood that her life hadn't been reborn through magic or reward, but because even when it felt empty, she had chosen to remain human. And that, silently, changed everything. A year after that snowy night, the woman who had arrived in Denver with an old bag and fear in her bones no longer recognized herself in the reflections of the past. Not because she had become someone different, but because she had become someone again. The foundation had grown in a way no one expected. Job training programs, emotional support networks for women who arrived with nothing, just as she had. Every story she heard had a familiar echo, and that didn't weaken her. On the contrary, it reminded her why she was there. She learned to speak in public, with a calmness she hadn't possessed before, to lead teams without raising her voice, to make difficult decisions without feeling guilty for existing. There were tiring days, of course, days when the memory of the lost marriage appeared like a stinging scar, but it didn't hurt like it used to. It was just a mark, not an open wound. She understood, like time, that she didn't need to struggle to keep going. She just didn't need to live in prison year after year. Today, when she thinks about the beginning of it all, she doesn't first remember her ex-husband, the humiliation, or the empty house. She remembers a freezing cold station, the sound of the wind seeping through the walls, and a man shivering with cold whom no one noticed. She remembers the exact feeling of handing over those $10, not as a heroic act, but as an almost automatic, human, desperately human impulse. And she understands finally that that gesture didn't just save another person. It saved her from becoming bitter, closed off, hardened by betrayal. Her life wasn't rebuilt by magic or divine reward, but because even when she was broken, she chose to remain true to herself. Now she holds a higher position within the organization, with responsibilities she never imagined having. And when she walks through the lobby each morning, she doesn't feel invisible. She feels present, whole, and she knows that even if she doesn't fully understand everything she went through, that day marked a definitive turning point.